Good evening. Welcome to our Farminar series. This is Luke Grand speaking from Practical Farmers of Iowa here in central Iowa. Nice to have so many folks from around the country who are joining us. Look at this, Missouri, Kansas, Minnesota. Man, I want to believe it's all for me, but I'm pretty sure it's Linda is why you're here. So just a couple slides for me, a couple minutes to thank you all for coming again. And this is our last Farminar of the 2011 spring series, and it's been quite a ride. We're really happy to have you with us. Over 750 folks have tuned in live to watch, and over 2,000 more are watching the recordings online. And so we're really happy to have you a part of this group, and wanted to thank you for your participation throughout the series. And we'll be happy to continue the Farminar series next fall in the off season. Thank you to our supporters, the Ceres Foundation, Farm Aid, and the Beginning Farmer Rancher Development Program of the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, USDA Grant 2010-4940021843. I never did say that whole thing, so I wanted to make sure I did it this time, since it's my last chance of the year. We are Practical Farmers of Iowa. We believe in healthy food, diverse farms, and vibrant communities throughout Iowa and beyond. Thank you very much for attending. We encourage all folks who watch Farminars to join our organization. We're a 1,700 member grassroots farmer organization, and just about 33% of our members are not farmers. They're friends of farmers. So whether or not you're a farmer, you're welcome into the conversation at Practical Farmers of Iowa. But we are very farmer focused in our programming. And if you like what you see here tonight, if you liked what you've seen in these past Farminars, man, I think I should look into working for the Iowa Public Radio. I'm starting to sound like the pledge week. But it is very important to, Ross, that's a great question. I will contact you for the fall program. I've got all your emails, and I will continue to use that technology to let everyone know when things are coming. So thanks for that, Ross. Good question there. But I encourage all of you who are watching to, if not join PFI, to donate online. It's a great way to make a tax-deductible contribution to something that's going to help farmers across the country and maybe even around the world. We share our research on the internet, and we've had over 26 years of farmer-led research, and we share these Farminars online on the internet, practicalfarmers.org/Farminar, a great way to continue to learn from farmers when it's convenient for you. A couple benefits of being a member of Practical Farmers of Iowa is you get a field day guide mailed to you each May, which lists 30 on-farm events around the state of Iowa, featuring farmers as leaders and welcoming folks to their farm to learn and see with their own eyes, walk the fields, and test out what's going on, and ask for input. We also offer a members-only email list service, so you can get online with members only of Practical Farmers of Iowa and ask questions. We have a grazing listserv, a poultry listserv, policy, general listserv for general questions, and I might be forgetting one. Horticulture, that's right, we have a horticulture list service. We also offer a discount to our annual conference just for members. And probably most importantly is you get to be a part of this movement, this very important sustainable agriculture movement that is building and building every year. Our organization is growing 14% each of the last 3 years, and this movement is growing around the country. So it's a really great time to become a member of Practical Farmers of Iowa. Here at the office, we always try to let our members know exactly what we're up to, because we are accountable to our members. We are writing grants feverishly. We're fundraising, getting things ready to pay for not only staff salaries, but paying farmers for their knowledge. We believe in being a very fiscally sound organization, and that's what we're up to. And in fact, if you have any suggestions for vendors you might use that we might want to solicit for donations to this kind of offering of these kind of programming, just let us know. Let me know. Luke@practicalfarmers.org is my email address. I'd be happy to contact a vendor in your area on behalf of Practical Farmers of Iowa for a tax-deductible contribution. Additionally, we do research projects, or I should say our farmers do the research, and we just help coordinate that research project that go on all over the state of Iowa and around the Midwest even. We have projects into Wisconsin and Minnesota, Illinois, Nebraska. Those go on throughout the growing season, so we are feverishly coordinating those events with farmers and those research projects. And we are doing field days, of course, as I've already mentioned, June through November. Great way to learn on-farm from folks face-to-face. And we offer a special opportunity for youth. if you've got a child who's a member of Practical Farmers of Iowa, maybe a family membership, youth mini grants are a wonderful opportunity to incorporate that youth's desire for on-farm research and demonstration. Maybe it's a food project, maybe it's a poultry project. Across the board, we want to help with small mini grants, $50 to $250 each, and help that youth really try out a new idea. Maybe it's a feeding trial, or want to try to grow a different variety of seed, or share cooking tips with youth. We would like to support that. So we do have a deadline, April 15th. If you're interested in your child signing up for this opportunity, just fill out the application and get back to us by April 15th. You can find more online, or if you just send me an email, luke@practicalfarmers.org. Be happy to get that information to you. Chris Blanchard is here. Chris, I'm a big fan. I just got to say, this is our feature, and we are definitely very pleased to have Linda Halley with us tonight. And keeping good farm records is a very important topic, always on the forefront of our farmer member minds. And we are very pleased to welcome her this evening. So I will just switch over the slides, and Linda, you may begin.
All right, can you hear me? It's coming, I can see it. Great. I can see my slides, and I'm hoping everyone else can. This is a first Farminar for me, so it feels very odd that you can't see me, I can't see you, and you can all just see these slides. So I hope it goes well. Good evening. My name is Linda Halley. I'm the farm manager of Gardens of Eagan in Farmington, Minnesota. And this is the PFR Farminar, Keeping Good Farm Records. My experience as a farmer is an owner and manager of mostly mid-sized diverse vegetable farms, certified organic, 50 to 100 acres with 50 to 100 different varieties of crops. I've operated farms with marketing enterprises from CSA to farmers market, roadside stands, selling to wholesale, retail, restaurants. I think as a vegetable farmer, I've covered most of the markets possible. I'm wondering, Luke, if we can put up the first poll. Is that possible? Where we ask, what types of farming operations do you all run? Maybe we don't know how to do, I don't know how to put up a poll, so maybe we'll see if Luke does. There it goes. So looks to me like most people are indeed vegetable farmers. 77% mixed vegetable. People are changing their mind, and maybe it's because some people do more than one thing. They may have livestock and vegetables. But I think this poll helps me quite a bit understand where you're all coming from. How do we take it away, Luke? Close. There we go. I'm going to talk about two kinds of records tonight, and both of them are important to understanding the big picture of your farm or operation. There's financial records and production records. My biggest focus tonight will be on production, but I'd like to start with financial, simply because I think it's the most straightforward part. Financial records, we keep them for a variety of reasons: to comply with tax and labor laws, to collect receivables. We would want to share our financial records with lenders. Hopefully it'll be persuasive. And we want to make sure we pay all of our bills. Another reason to keep good financial records. Production records we might keep for different reasons. Keeping production records will help us when we do some price setting, make capital investment decisions, cropping decisions, and marketing and enterprise development. Production records often also include planning parts that, unless you create a farm budget before you start your year, you don't do as much planning on the financial side. Production usually starts with planning. The reasons we keep records and the kinds of records we keep all go together, financial and production, to create different parts of the big picture puzzle. That's another way of saying they help us with whole farm planning, creating an organic system plan, and also they support our gut instincts. I'm guessing that most of us make most of our decisions with gut instincts, and that's a really good way to do it. But it's really nice to also think that your records, when you crunch those numbers, support the gut instinct. And if they don't, maybe they make you think about it twice. This is a really basic outline of financial records, a P&L basically, profit and loss sheet, pared down to its skeleton. There's the income side on the top, where you're keeping track of your sales income, any income from services, like if you do custom operator work, and miscellaneous income, such as insurance payments or co-op dividends. The bottom part would be your expenses. And I broke it down into 4 categories. You may want to break it down into more. This is just a basic skeleton that would certainly get you by. I use a little bit more detailed accounting. If you're just starting out, this might be a good place to start. So looking a little more closely at the financial part on top, the income, it's really important to record all of your sales and all of your service, no matter how you get paid. So if you sell a crop and you invoice for it, make that invoice immediately, give the invoice upon giving the product, or if for some reason you don't make that happen, do it immediately afterward, the next day if at all possible. A lot of transactions might be cash sales. Someone comes to my farm sometimes and buys bushels of tomatoes. It would be really important for me to make a sales receipt in my computerized records or my ledger. Even if the person doesn't want a sales receipt, even if they're not requiring it, for me to record it is really important. I'm wondering how many people use computerized records. Luke, I think we have a poll about what kind of record keeping people use. So just basically, it's do you use QuickBooks or another accounting program in your computer, or by ledger? Right now, looks like the vast majority of you use some kind of computerized records. Okay. I think that's helpful because I use computerized records. It's easy to talk about that. If you use a ledger, it's just as good, but you have to, I think computerized records allow you to sort and organize and look back a little more quickly. If you use pencil and paper, you simply have to be familiar enough with it so you can look back and find those records in a timely fashion. I'm going to talk a little bit about each part of the expense part of the financial records. So just a definition about what I consider to be an admin expense. Really, I think of it as anything that is not an input. In other words, there's some examples: land rent, or what it takes to run my office, certification costs, insurance costs, or services, trash removal service or accounting service, any kind of professional legal service. Those I would consider to be administrative expenses. And if I'm not sure, I ask myself, well, is this an input? And if it is, I generally don't put it in administration. Labor expenses. On most vegetable farms, like most of us are operating, this is the single biggest cost. You want to keep very good track of it. And mostly this is what we keep the best track of, because by law, there are a lot of laws that relate to payroll expenses and taxes and reporting. So anything that's a wage or the payroll taxes that go with those wages is obviously under labor. Workers' comp is an insurance, but it's not an insurance you'd carry if you didn't have any labor expenses. So I consider it a labor expense. And then any contracted labor, unless it's a professional service. So if you hire someone just for an afternoon to help you stack bales, you pay them cash, record that labor as a labor cost, not as a service or an administrative cost. Operating expenses, this tends to be the biggest category, and I actually break this down on my farm to include a little more detail. You can do what makes sense on your farm. Livestock farms versus vegetable farms often have very different operating expenses and lists of inputs. But this is where I keep my inputs, like fertilizer, seeds, gas, fuel, and oil, supplies that I'm going to consume in 1 or 2 years, small tools, and that's not even close to an exhaustive list for sure. Delivery vehicle expenses you might want to keep in this. It's an operating expense, and you want to keep that separate from the other vehicles. Greenhouses on a vegetable farm can be a big expense. You might want to keep that even separately. Someone's typing. I'll see if it's a question, I'll try to answer your question, Andy. Oh, you're just coming to join us. Glad to have you along. Okay, the final expense category I have is capital expenses, and these are things that appear on your depreciation list or your Section 179 expense. I really like to include anything that's over $1,000 in value. You can set that wherever you're comfortable. Some people like to maybe go to 2,000 if they have a modern farm. Some people go to 500. It's really anything that's going to last several years. And in fact, by law, there are certain things you have to depreciate. You're supposed to depreciate all structures and all major improvements to structures. Even if you use Section 179, which a lot of farmers like to because it reduces their taxes for the year, you're kind of going to want to figure out what value you would be depreciating, even if you use Section 179 it on your taxes. So just a really brief review of the financial record keeping. It's going to tell you your net profit. Your gross income minus your expenses gives you your net profit. This might be a time for people to type in a few questions, I'm going to go through a few financial records tips while you're typing, if you'd like to. A tip that I really recommend is learn how to interpret financial statements, your P&L and your balance sheet. They're very different. They're both generated from it's easily generated from your computerized records, not as easily generated if you use a ledger sheet. You can ask an accountant for a definition. This is really easy to learn from a book. I highly recommend, if you're not comfortable knowing the difference, that you find out, inform yourself. Profit and loss is really the expenses, the income and the expenses, like the top and bottom of the previous slides. But a balance sheet includes really, in a way, your business's net worth. So if you own a tractor and you've already paid for it, you still own that value. It's still an asset. And that's where it will appear, that asset will appear on your balance sheet. So a question that Luke asked was, how do you learn to set up QuickBooks well? I would definitely set up QuickBooks with a tutor, a personal tutor, if you know someone who uses QuickBooks, because even QuickBooks for Dummies tends to confuse me a little bit, and I've set up several different companies in QuickBooks. If you don't have a personal tutor that you can just invite in while you're putting the numbers in, then I definitely suggest using QuickBooks for Dummies or the QuickBooks Help. And there are a lot of QuickBooks classes you can take at tech schools, often for very, very cheap. So inform yourself on what's available around your area. Specifically, Luke says, your chart of accounts. So your chart of accounts, you could start with what's on your Schedule F that you're going to take off as expenses. But then the top part, the income part, you're going to have an asset for farm equipment, an asset account for structures, your bank account, which is another kind of asset account, and probably you'll have petty cash. So your chart of accounts looks a lot like that P&L, income accounts and expense accounts. And to get more specific, I would say would not really be the scope of this, this talk. QuickBooks has so many bells and whistles, Ross says. Do you know of a simple ledger sheet type computer program? I do not. But I do know that if you're comfortable with a paper ledger, it's possible you could be comfortable with an Excel spreadsheet. I don't do that myself, but I do know some people who do. It's a way to computerize a piece of paper, basically. And Damien says, what should I consider to determine whether to set up the farm as an LLC or an INC or a DBA? These are all questions that I am not qualified to answer. And Kathy says, are there other accounting computer programs? The other accounting computer programs I know about are actually more complex than QuickBooks. I know of Peachtree. That's it. I'm going to move on to another tip while a couple people start typing. Oh, this tip you need to correct. Figure your net profits without your Section 179. It's not 169. It's Section 179. I just had a brain lapse there when I typed that in. And once I sent it off to Luke, I couldn't fix it. So it's Section 179. It's a deduction for things that normally appear on your depreciation schedule. Once you decide to deduct them, as Section 179. They'll never appear on your depreciation schedule again. So they really only count as an expense for that single year in which you deduct them. You know, the reason you want to figure your net profits without that is because it really makes your profit at the end of the year look low, which of course might be your goal. But that's your goal for paying taxes. It's not your goal when you're looking at your records. When you look at your records, you want to know truly how much money, how much net profit you made that year. Damien, the farm I run right now is set up as an LLC, and the farm I ran previous to this was a nonprofit 501c3, and prior to that it was set up as a sole proprietorship. So there are advantages to having an LLC or a sole proprietorship, and you really need to talk to, I think, a farm accountant in order to determine what's best for your farm. And how do you determine how to price your products, and what kind of record keeping do you utilize for that? Marissa, that is perfect. This is a segue into the next part of the record keeping talk. So let me go through a couple more tips, and then we're going to get on to production record keeping. On this tip, I say, do not count off-farm job income in farm profits. And many farmers have off-farm jobs, and many farmers use that money to pay for their farming expenses. But it's really not part of your farm-generated income. You can't just stick it in there and say that you made it on the farm. In many ways, it's a loan from the person who has that job. And you may never pay it back, but it's money that came in to your business without really earning it through the activity of the farm. And this is, I think, my last tip, and it's important. Set aside time to regularly record. So whether you use a ledger or whether you use a computer, sit down and set aside a time, at the minimum, a full day a month. It's a lot better to do it regularly, once a week, a couple hours a week, to make sure that you've recorded cash income, entered your receipts before they get old and you have no idea what they were for. Let's see. Luke. Yeah, I love this crowd. They have lots of questions. And there will be time at the end for questions. So if you don't get your question answered before I move on, don't feel bad. Remind me of the question when we get to the end. Andy says Extension Farm Management Specialists and the value-added ag programs can help you figure out how to set up your farm business. All right, good, Andy. Thank you for that. I really appreciate when people are able to answer the questions and jump in, because it looks to me like there's a lot of knowledge in the participant pool here tonight. One more tip. It's not really a tip, but I stuck it on this Post-it note anyway. There's two different kinds of accounting methods. You can choose cash accounting or accrual accounting. Most farms are on a cash accounting basis. It's the most intuitive kind of accounting. Basically, if you have the money in your pocket or your bank account, you have the money. And if the bill is in your inbox and you haven't recorded it yet, well, you still have your money. With accrual, once you enter the bill into your financial record keeping, it's like you don't have that money anymore. So it's not as intuitive, because sometimes you can see the money. It's right in your hand. There are different reasons for cash versus accrual accounting. You'd want to talk to your accountant, and if you don't have an accountant, you're probably using cash accounting unless you are an accountant. It's a little bit complicated and not as intuitive. And now that I use accrual accounting here on this farm, I recognize its benefits. but I also feel like I've lost a little bit of control and understanding of my own business here. So before you go into accrual accounting, ask a lot of questions of the person who's recommending that. What really truly are the benefits for your particular operation? So, Luke, I think I have poll 3, which just asks what types of marketing do people use on their farming operation? Because now we're kind of moving into those production records. And depending on what kind of marketing you do, you'll be keeping different kinds of records, and it'll be more complex. I don't know if you can check more than one or not. I assume people actually do use more than one. Oh, every single person's a CSA farmer? Woo! That's kind of amazing. Yes, Luke says you can check more than one. So lots of CSA farmers, a lot of direct marketing, not as much wholesale and retail. All right. Well, that's really helpful. I have to say that keeping wholesale and retail records are much easier. Is that going to go away, Luke? It won't go away on my screen. There it goes. Luke has the ultimate control, I think. Let's move along and look a little bit at production. So production record keeping always involves planning, and then you carry it out and you get a result. Budgeting would be the planning part of your financial record keeping. And I do budgeting here for special projects, and I do budgeting for my whole farm because I'm required to. But I have to say that when I was just part of a sole proprietorship farm, we didn't do a lot of budgeting, except for special projects if we're going to do a building project or something. Production record keeping always involves a plan. And even if it's just a list of what you're going to do today, that's still a plan. And then if you keep track of what you did, you've got the actual record. And if you actually know how to access your actual record, you can find out your yield or your results. And so this is really where the meat of farm record keeping happens. Most of the production record systems I know about are made by each operator, or certainly customized by each operator. If anybody knows of affordable production record keeping for a diverse vegetable farm, it would be a welcome thing to have. Please speak up. I feel like it's really expensive to buy good quality production record keeping for a diverse farm, and I've always designed my own. Now remember, we're not talking QuickBooks anymore. We're talking production. And you have to figure out how to mesh QuickBooks with your production records in the end. But for production records, do what you're most comfortable with. If it's just writing your operations and how much yield you got on a map of your farm for whatever field, and keeping other records in a ledger, that's fine. Most people would want to keep them in a spreadsheet of some kind. The most important part of this is really keeping the records. If you make a to-do list and then you write down what you did and you tweaked it a little bit in the process of doing it, keep that record. It will really help you in the end. If you toss away your records, you have not been record keeping at all. I thought I would start with spring and talking about our production record keeping, because in reality, I think you're going to make your own records. But by looking at the records I keep, hopefully you'll start to think about your operation and how it would fit into this amount of record keeping. that I do. So spring, this is our 2011 greenhouse plan, and it's a plan, and then it's the actual. So the plan part is the part that's filled in with the computer, the crops, the varieties, the dates that we're going to seed them, and then going over to the right, how many we have a goal of planting in the field, and on what date is our goal to plant in the field. Everything in the middle gets filled out as we actually do it. So this is the same sheet, a little bit larger. Actually, it's not much easier to see on my screen, but it really highlights, I think, the fact that we're writing this down all the time, and we're keeping track of more than just, hey, Luke, oh, there's the pointer. There we go. So we're keeping track of more than just we plant in the greenhouse. We're also keeping track of a little bit of labor on this ticket. We're keeping track of seeding time. And so down here, you can see that it took someone, 1.5 hours to plant the number of flats there. So we're kind of sneaking in some labor records while we're also making a plan for what we're going to grow in the greenhouse. This particular spreadsheet is kept by date. So I can walk into the greenhouse and know that on 3/16, I have to get all of this done. It really helps me plan my day or my week. It's not so easy to look back at how much broccoli I planted or exactly what happened when I planted the broccoli. So we have another sheet that we take to the greenhouse or to where we seed our plants, and it's kept by crop. So this is actually the directive for how to plant or transplant broccoli. This was Gypsy number 1, which was the variety we were planting, and it was the first time we were planting it. So it's just a little easier to find this record if we know that it's under B for broccoli. Also the record, again, I want to remind you, production records are plans, ultimately, and we've snuck in not just plans, but a little bit of information, instructions. So even if you've done this 3 or 4 times, the fact that when you get the directive that tells you how many, you also get a reminder of how to do it. So it says how to plant the greenhouse transplants. And then next time around, when we go back to the same group of plants and we transplant them into a larger cell, it'll tell you how to do that. Why do we have instructions along with the plan for numbers? It's just an easy way to have a reminder in there. And if your production records have more than one purpose, people are actually more likely to be using them. By people, I mean you too, you yourself. Even if you've created the plan, sometimes you set it aside and don't use it if it's not very helpful or there's not very many reasons to do so. So this is a plan, and it's the actual record. The computerized part is filled in. It's actually cut and paste from my previous sheet. And then when you go into the greenhouse or into the room where we do our seeding, you actually have handwritten records of what you've actually done. And sometimes they're significantly different. You can see that our planting goal was 4,700 gypsy broccoli, but we actually had 5,040 by the number of plants that we planted. So when we go out to the field, we again want to have another accurate record, not just a plan. If you had a plan and the actual was different, you can't use your plan numbers to figure out your true results. We also have a little way of recording what happened that day. And people are more likely to record what happened if there's other reasons to have this information. when they're all done with this broccoli seeding directive, they fill out the date completed and who it was, the time they started and ended. And once again, we're inserting some labor records. At least we'll have the numbers if we're interested in finding out how much it costs to run a kind of plant through the greenhouse. We'll have some numbers on how long it takes to plant those flats. You guys are really talkative over there. Thanks, Chris, for answering the questions. I'm just reading now. You're chatting back and forth. Hopefully, if there's anything really important, someone will write it down twice so I don't miss it. Now we've gone from our greenhouse production. Now we take the plants out into the field. So we're moving along in the spring, and since we haven't planted anything yet, I went back to 2010 to get this record, and you can see it really does go to the field. It gets dirty. People write notes on it, and there's some actual, there's the plan and the actual again. I think you can see it a little better here. So this is a pepper crop, and we have our goal in the greenhouse plant date and the goal for the number of plugs. Again, this is just cut and paste out of an Excel spreadsheet onto this field guide, which is now what they're going to take it out to the field. And part of it gets filled in by hand. Sometimes it's messy, and sometimes it's hard to read, and sometimes we find that our plan is quite different than the actual, especially if someone maybe didn't measure the field out really well. But at least we have the records to go back to. Now you can imagine in the spring, when you have lots and lots of records and you're out in the field hours and hours every day, you get a lot of these sheets. You can see why I'm going to say plan a time when you can regularly sit down at your computer and fill these in. Because even though you've written them in by hand, you can't really crunch the numbers until the computer can see them. If you're a person who likes pencil and paper and ledger, that's actually okay too. And you have a little bit more time flexibility when you can actually add those numbers up, because it's still going to be a manual process. But with your Excel spreadsheet, you really can't add them up unless you want to do it by hand. You can't add them up with the computer until you've got them entered. So we don't plant everything from a transplant here at Gardens of Eagan. So this one is just a really basic spreadsheet. It's the plan and the actual, and you're looking at a spreadsheet for a direct-seeded edamame crop. Planting number 1 and 2 are what show up on here. And this is what the spreadsheet looks like before you've made a plan at all. And you're going to want to make your plan well in advance. You're going to want to make your plan before you even decide what field to put it in, so that you know whether it's going to fit in that field. But a blank spreadsheet is a really basic tool, so I wanted to show you something that has absolutely nothing in it. You might make the plan in the fall or early in the spring, sometime in the winter, and then when you actually get out to the field, you fill in the actual. So, I wanted to go back. I wonder if I can go back a little bit. It's not terribly important, but sometimes we find that our record sheets include things that we never, ever record. So in this case, we have a total picked column. We never really write down our total pick on this particular spreadsheet, and we can just leave it off next year. It's good to have the first pick date and the second pick date and a last pick date if we pick it 3 times, but that kind of helps us understand the maturity, the number of days to maturity on this farm during this particular year, which is often not really comparable to what they say in the seed catalog. But we find we've never ever filled out the total picked because we keep it in a different place. So we keep our harvest record on our harvests on our harvest record. So this is an example of a harvest record. Kind of updated. It's not the one we actually use this year. So when you come in to the packing shed with any harvest at all, you must fill out this record. The crop name, the field number, the units picked, that's what's really important. So you might have broccoli in field 67 and you pick 20 cases. Then on the same harvest record, we're going to keep some labor data. So I ask that people write down how many people were there, how many hours, and then if there's any specific conditions they want to say, like hard rain, that would tell me that probably it took longer than average, or quality issues, that would tell me that it could have taken longer than average. But since I've really emphasized to people that all harvests must get recorded, I have some labor data on the same sheet, and it's not very hard for people to just fill those in. On the other hand, this is an actual harvest sheet, and I can't say that it's filled in perfectly, even though we emphasize there's no exceptions. The cabbage got recorded really nicely. We get down to the cauliflower, and I happen to know that that's a different person and a different crew. He wrote down how many totes, but he didn't say how many people were helping him and how many hours it took. Nevertheless, you know, we can forgive a few errors, but mostly because we do this every day for every harvest, every time, we do end up with pretty darn good harvest records. We certainly end up with the yield of what we have picked. Sometimes the people hours don't get recorded quite as well. So where can you keep your yield data? Well, obviously on those harvest sheets we have yield data. QuickBooks, if you use wholesale and retail accounts mostly, and you write invoices, you'll get all of your yield data in QuickBooks automatically, but it'll be in dollars, and that's sometimes hard to work with. You can also record your farmers market sales on sales receipts, cash receipts. I think I'll show you an example of that in a little while. But I found that keeping track of how much product goes into your CSA really requires a special separate CSA spreadsheet. This is a really, really basic spreadsheet. If you kept track of this, it wouldn't take you very long, and I think you'd find you have most of the information you need. So each week, or each delivery, if you deliver several times a week, you're going to want to fill it out. I think I filled out an example here. Well, this would be simple if you only had 4 things in your box, right? But basically, you want to include the crop, the number of shares, amount per share. They just get 1 cabbage. This can be a formula. It can be, you know, second column times the third column. You don't have to actually fill that in. And then you want to fill in a value. My habit has been to fill in the farmer's market price. Now, if you don't go to a farmer's market, you might not know that price, or you might have to go to a farmer's market to find out the price. If you sell to retail customers, then you might shop the retail aisle for the price. How much do people buy a cabbage for on the retail grocery aisle, and that could be your price. So you have to decide how you're going to come up with a value for that cabbage, and I really like farmers market because it's sort of the alternative way to shop for fresh produce directly from a farmer. And then it would do the math for you, dollars per share, and in the end you're going to get your total share value. This particular share delivery had a value of $27, and then you have a weekly total, $27 times however many shares, in this case 50. That's your weekly produce value for that CSA share. It's really difficult to enter this into QuickBooks because you get the money at a completely different time than you make the share up. You can't really design the shares in advance and say how much people are going to get any particular week. So I find that I make invoices for CSA members in my QuickBooks, but it's not where I can really figure out how many cabbages or how many melons or how many pounds of green beans I delivered to them. So I keep a separate spreadsheet for that. Sometimes $27 doesn't really relate to how much they paid me for each share. And when I get to the very end of the year, I know how much money I took in from all my CSA members, and if I have all these spreadsheets, I know the value of all the produce I sold to them. And I can figure whether there was actually a discount for my CSA vegetables or a premium. And I actually figure a percent for that. Generally, people get more than they paid for, and there's basically a discount for my CSA income. This is an example of how we record our farmers market, because I like to record everything in QuickBooks, and farmers market's kind of tricky. You know how much money you came home with. So I know I came home with $652, and I know that I sold 23 Romanesco because I can count them. I know how many I took, and I can count how many I brought home. I know how many I counted, and I know what I charged for them. But when I get it all done with, the 30 or 40 different things I took to market and all the different ways I sold them, my total doesn't really come out to $652.50. So I actually keep track of things that I donate. Often, farmers markets have a service where people come around and ask for donated produce at the end. And I actually record that. Not real carefully, but I do record it. And I make sure to take that as a value. And then I have a line, you could call it the fudge factor. It's the discount that must have happened at the farmer's market. Either I sold some things as, if it's a 2 for sale, sometimes I sell things $1.50 a bunch, but if you buy 2, the price is actually $1.25. And so that's really difficult to record, but it reduces the amount of money you're going to come home with. And so if you do a lot of those kinds of sales, or something looks a little dinged and you say, oh no, go ahead, take that melon for, 50 cents off or whatever, you're going to end up with this fudge factor. And I manually put that in as value of discount prices taken at the market. I'm pretty happy with this. It might not be a complete and accurate picture, but it gives me a pretty good idea of my market income. The other thing I have to say is that I keep track of each item a little differently. When I sell produce to my wholesale account, I don't sell my Romanesco by the each. I sell it by a box of 15 or 20 pounds or whatever it happens to be. But at the farmer's market, I sell it by the each. So I have a special item line for Romanesco that gets sold at the farmer's market. And Same with peppers. I don't sell roasted peppers to wholesalers, but I do sell roasted peppers by the bag at the farmer's market. So that's a special line that really only appears for produce, the peppers sold at the market. So Luke, you say, did you sell a $500 TV at market? No, why? Where did the rest of that money come from? Oh, well, this isn't a live screen, so it's the part of the invoice, the sales receipt you can't see. Okay? Sorry. Yeah. That was a good question, actually. What did I want to say about this one? I guess I really wanted to just say that when you make your plan and you carry out your plan in your production records, when you get to the end, you've got to get yield or results. And if you've entered your records in QuickBooks, either as sales receipts, invoices, or cash sales, you get your yield or results. And you may also have to wait till your CSA season is over to figure out exactly how you want to put those in. But QuickBooks makes your yields and your results, yields or results, same thing, really easy to access. This is an example of a sales report by item. And so starting with basil and ending with zucchini, no doubt, it'll tell me for any selected range of dates, for the whole season or just for 1 week, it'll tell me what I've earned on each individual item. It can also compare from one year to another, which is really hard to do when you're using a ledger, but it's not impossible. So here's an example of some more labor hours that I keep track of. It's called the Harvest Time Study. And if you look at the gray columns, those are the same things that we kept track of on our harvest sheet in the packing shed. So I can get that information from looking at all the packing sheets. The white columns are actually formulas or constants that are entered in my computer depending on which crop I'm referring to. So let's just go through them. Well, let's go through red bells. So we have the crop name, and they picked 26, in this case, units. Now, on the harvest record sheet, I said to indicate units. And so I happen to know this is 26 totes. But if I write the word tote in there, Excel will not add it up, multiply it, divide it. It won't do any operation. So you have to leave it completely numerical. 26 totes. That's equivalent to 42 cases. And it took 9 people, 2/3 of an hour. This is math. It multiplied people times hours. This is some more math. The computer multiplied cases per hour. I had to put in a cost. No, this is also math. What's the cost per case? The cost to harvest, $1.84 per case. And that's because I have a constant in how much I pay people. And when I try to figure out how much I pay people, I take their hourly wage and I take into consideration my workers' comp costs, and I take into consideration the taxes that I have to pay. So I actually use a number of $12.50 per hour. Even though they don't take home $12.50 an hour on average, I try to come up with a realistic cost that it costs the farm to have one person working for 1 hour. So my cost per case is figured with a constant of $12.50 an hour, and my value per case is how much I sell that red bell pepper case for, $23.50. That has to be entered each time I use a spreadsheet, or there can be a constant filled in for that. That's more elaborate than I get. I usually just go back and look in QuickBooks and see how much I sell it for and enter that in. And then it'll figure out my percent for harvest labor. In other words, it costs me 8% of my sale value, $23.50, costs me 8% to get that pepper harvested. Take a look at the broccoli and the edamame that are in the red circle. It costs me 10% of the broccoli value to harvest the broccoli. And edamame, you know, picking those potted soybeans by hand, costs me 25% of what I sell them for just to pick them. That's some information that is going to make me think twice about whether I want to grow more edamame, or buy a machine, or raise the price, or not grow it at all. We do the same thing with packing, because harvesting isn't the only thing you do. You also have to pack that crop. Really interesting. We decided to pack broccoli in the field based on this kind of packing number. Again, the gray columns come from the harvest sheets that people fill out every time they harvest and bring something into the pack shed. So it's the crop, the cases packed, the people, and how many hours. That comes from the harvest sheets in my packing shed. But then when I get all the way over here, I found out that, let's see, cases packed 47. I actually packed 47 cases right in the field. It cost, oh no wait, this was 47 cases packed in the packing shed, and it cost me 1% of the value to pack my broccoli. We used corn boxes because they're bigger and they're easier to pack in. So I decided, if we pack right in this field, am I going to save myself a significant amount of money? Actually, this one makes it seem like I'm only saving 1% of the value of my broccoli, but when we used real broccoli boxes instead of corn boxes, it usually took us about 2%. And any little thing seemed to help. So we ended up moving right into picking and packing our broccoli in the field, as long as field conditions would allow. Again, down here, I made a note that this was a watermelon pick and pack was 11%. I wish I could remember the rule of thumb we used to go by, but if it cost 20% or more to pick and pack your product, 20% of the value, the sales value of it, you were approaching something that was not terribly tenable. I think now I spend a lot more money on that. Maybe I just have a different standard for how I train my crew and what my expenses are. At any rate, looking at those percents for picking and packing can really give you an idea which crops really maybe you need to focus on. Better training so you pick and pack more quickly, or mechanizing so that you spend less labor dollars. Of course, you will have had to buy the machine. So I want to just talk a little bit about some extra expenses. So production, you get your yields, not just crop yields, and your production costs are not just your expenses. You have, let's take a look at labor costs can be 35 to 55% of all your expenses on your farm. Some crops take more labor than others. is it worth singling out labor as an extra cost to keep track of? Last year at Gardens of Eagan, we started keeping track not just of people's time on time cards, which we'd been doing, but now we were asking people to figure out where their time was spent. So this is an example of a by-hand record sheet that people fill out at the end of every day. And we actually got this record sheet from a program called Veggie, which is a whole farm planning thing that you actually could participate in if you wanted to. But the important part is that they've kind of looked at how a farm can rationally keep track of labor hours without spending too much time on it. Because if you ask your crew to spend too much time, they're just not going to do a good job. So they can just write how many hours they were in the greenhouse right here. That's pretty easy. And most of the year, there's nothing in there. Then if they were harvesting and packing something, they write how many hours here or here or here or here. I mean, that's pretty easy. And then there's the things you do that just are not specific to any crop. I'm not sure what harvest and packing not specific to any crop would be. I guess maybe that's cleaning the packing shed or reorganizing the boxes, which is sort of a packing task. But right here, field growing hours, it's really anything that's not harvest and packing and anything that's not for one specific crop. And a lot of things kind of get bundled in here, or maybe you're actually weeding the cabbage or actually tying the tomatoes. You'd put your not harvest and packing hours under those crops. We found that our crew is really happy to keep those records. Some people understand them better than others. What we learned from last year was that we're just going to do it again and do even better, because for me, labor is a significant portion of my expenses, and I want to find out how I can control those costs without just simply saying, I'm not going to pay people very much. I guess my motto is, I want to pay them as much as I possibly can, because it keeps them coming back and it keeps them happy, but I still have to make my farm profitable in order to employ anybody at all. Again, we've got yields and production costs, but I just want to emphasize that besides labor, some inputs can be very expensive. Is it worth keeping track of certain inputs in a special way, not just on your income or your expense? Is it worth keeping track of them and isolating them? Just talk a little bit about, well, I haven't really talked about allocated. So if you took all of your expenses, you get to the bottom line, and you have $100,000 in expenses, and you have 100 acres that you farm, you could say it costs you $1,000 per acre to run your farm. And those are allocated expenses. I call them allocated because they're allocated by acre. Or if you have a small farm, you can allocate them by square feet, row feet, times how many feet between rows. But that's pretty rough estimate, just allocating by square foot or by acre. So some expenses, I think, qualify as crop-specific expenses. Field plastics, for example. I don't use drip tape and plastic mulch on every single crop, but when I pay my bill in the spring to buy those things, I realize they're expensive. So I have a spreadsheet where I keep track of those inputs. This is just a little piece of the spreadsheet. It lists T-tape and perforated plastic, metallized striped plastic, and green embossed plastic. and I figured out how many feet I bought and what it cost me, and so I can figure out the cost per foot. And then really, this perforated plastic is only allocated to cucumbers. And the metallized striped plastic that's really expensive, I only use on cucumbers and onions. So am I going to take that cost per foot and say, well, I did 6,000 feet of cucumbers? It really is an extra cost that it wouldn't be fair to allocate to things like sweet corn. So if you keep track of these and you decide that some things are expensive enough to separate out, you can create certain crop-specific costs. And in order to not count them twice, as expenses twice, you have to remove their value from your allocated costs. These are some things that I think are worth keeping track of because they're expensive and they only go towards certain crops. Plastic mulch, granular fertilizer, pest control. I mean, I really don't use dipel on every crop, only on my brassicas. Greenhouse production. Not every crop goes through the greenhouse, and the greenhouse is an expensive proposition. Hoop house costs. If you're going to grow hoop house crops, certainly costs a different amount of money to grow them in the hoop house rather than out of the hoop house. Are you really getting a good return for that hoop house cost? Or special packaging. Some things need to be packaged. If you package green beans, for example, those bags don't cost very much. But if you package something in a printed Ziploc bag, that's certainly packaging that costs a lot of money, and you need to account for that. Luke, I need to know how much more time we have.
We have until 8:30.
Okay. I'm going to go through this a little bit briefly, and I think there'll still be about 10 minutes for questions. So here's some labor activities that you might want to count as crop specific because they only happen to certain crops and they can be very time consuming and expensive. Tying tomatoes or pruning tomatoes is one. Cleaning dry onions or cleaning dry garlic is another. Things that get bagged, like bagged baby spinach, or just things that take extra time picking. No matter how hard you train people, it's just slow, and you might want to include extra picking time for certain crops. Are they significant enough to count as crop-specific labor hours? On our farm, we're going to do that. If you're not keeping track of your labor hours right now, very carefully, just as a whole total for the end of the year, then don't go here first. It might drive your crew crazy. If you've kept all of those kinds of records, and a lot of them, remember, are planning records that you're going to make anyway, and then carrying them out records that you just write down as you're doing it. If you've kept all the financial records and those kind of production records, you have enough records to pull all the pieces together and really get a pretty amazing picture of your operation. I want to just mention the word Veggie Compass and let you see its name because it's maybe kind of weird. If you're really a record-keeping geek and you want to get a really good picture of your whole farm profit by enterprise, CSA, farmers market, wholesale, livestock, you should explore Veggie Compass. I think it's a powerful tool. First, you have to keep the records. Records give you a lot of power in making decisions about your business. So there aren't that many records to keep. I'm going to list them. your farm sales by crop and market channel, and your total cost of operating your farm. Those you can get from QuickBooks as you make your invoices or your sales receipts. Crop-specific costs for harvest and packing, or crop-specific costs for production. Those kinds of records take QuickBooks plus a spreadsheet of some kind. Most of our production records are kept on some kind of spreadsheet. Looking back into QuickBooks to find out our sales, and you combine them together, you have a lot of power. You can really analyze your cost of production. More records that give you power, just to remind you. You need to keep track of the growing area of each crop and the total area of the crop, of your whole farm. So whether you do it by acres or by square feet, we keep track of that through that field transplant record. It says row feet, and it also tells us how far apart each row is. So we can just do the math and find out the total acreage for each one of our transplanted crops or our direct seeded crops. And we go back to those spreadsheets to look for that. Also the number of plants grown in the greenhouse. You can think back to our greenhouse spreadsheets. We keep track of the number of plants, the number of flats, and plants in a flat. That's all in those spreadsheets. Very accessible. And then hours spent in field production for each crop. It's not as accessible, but even if we only added up the amount of time that people took harvesting things on that harvest sheet, we'd still have quite a lot of information about harvest and packing, and then the rest of it is obviously spent in field production. You can subtract from the total hours that you paid people for. So it doesn't seem like that many records that you have to keep. And then you can really find out a lot about your farm. I think this might be my last slide, and it would be nice to find out if there are any questions you might have. I think, Luke, there was one more poll where I suggested some questions people might be able to answer using records. I'm not sure how easy it will be to get through one of these, but we might try to answer the most popular question that someone would like to work through to find an answer. Okay, well, it was a hard decision. If you want to do your net crop per acre, let's see. We would start with, you have to know how many acres of something we plant. And on our farm, we find that out by looking at our field transplant record or our direct seeded crop spreadsheet. So now we have the amount of crop that we've planted, and we go back to QuickBooks and find out what we sold it for, our income. So we've got income minus our expenses. And expenses could be taken from your bottom line in QuickBooks, your bottom expenses to run your farm, allocated per acre. So like I said, if you have $100,000 in expenses on a 100-acre farm, you have $1,000 per acre expense for your crop. So you've got your income and minus your expenses per acre, and you know how many acres of that crop you grew. So those are super basic. That's a super basic calculation. The other one which was, if I had 50 CSA members, how many more peppers do I have to grow? Well, you have to keep track of, again, how many row feet or acres of peppers you grew and what its yield was. Since we keep track of everything in QuickBooks, we have to take how many cases of peppers we sold and multiply it by pounds or count. So on our farm, even though we sell things by the case, we know about how many peppers fill a case so that we can get a number. Because for CSA members, you're not going to weigh your peppers, you're going to give them a count of peppers. And then you have your CSA spreadsheet that tells you, how many peppers you give people on an average year. So really, I think that it's a pretty easy calculation if you just have those records there. Are there any other questions that you have about record keeping? I know that that's a little clunky to go through those questions without examples, but I couldn't figure out exactly which questions you all would want to know the answers to. But I've entertained other questions if you have some. So how should we ease into record keeping to not be overwhelmed and quit? Well, that's a really good question. If I was only going to keep two kinds of records, first of all, you have to, by law, you really have to keep your financial records. So that's a no-brainer. You have to do that. And to not be overwhelmed by it, you really just need to do some of it each week. I recommend Sunday afternoon. Oh, I know, it's supposed to be a time when you don't have to work. But pick a time when you can really stick to it. And I also really recommend that if there's more than one person involved in your operation, don't share that task. Because there's nothing worse than trying to figure out what the other person did. Then you will get overwhelmed when you go back to sit down in your books and someone did something and you don't know what it was and you have to ask them. So I recommend, if you share your operation, choose one person that's the most comfortable. And then the other person can help by taking care of the kids when you're doing the books or cooking a meal when you're doing the books. So that's a way to help out. And the other thing that I would keep track of besides my financial records is harvest. You don't have to do this yourself. Your employees, if you have one or two or volunteers or kids in the family, they can all learn how to write down those weights or count or cases and just make it a really big habit. Just like finding time to record things in your ledger, you also have to find time as soon as you come in with your harvest to record that. It just takes really seconds. So I hope that helped. Where would we find profit margin on a specific veggie? Well, that is really tricky, Damien. I use Veggie Compass to find my profit margin, but there's a profit margin on a specific veggie for every single enterprise because I'm guessing that you sell it for a different price and have different expenses for every single enterprise. Like expenses for CSA might include delivering, whereas expenses at the farmer's market might include your time to stand there and sell them. So the profit margin would really be, well, I'd have to go back to my Veggie Compass spreadsheet, but you've got, it's really hard for me to explain on here without having a spreadsheet in front of me that has the income and the expense by crop, and then your sales cost. So your sales value, I hope this is helpful, your sales value, like let's say $25 a box, and if you have all of your expenses included and it's cost you $20 a box to put that all together, include all your expenses, and provide it to your customer, then you've got $5 left, or a profit margin of, well, you have to do the math. But that little piece that's left is your profit margin. Did that help? Probably not. Sounds like you need another spreadsheet. You do kind of need a final spreadsheet, and that it really is what Veggie Compass does, but you don't have to have Veggie Compass. You can just put all your numbers in that final spreadsheet. You're absolutely right. And you might want to, I don't know how complex your business is and how many different enterprises or marketing channels you have, but you might want a different spreadsheet for each enterprise. Like, I just find that CSA has specific costs and very odd ways of calculating your value than, for example, a wholesale sales, where it's really clear what exactly it costs you to provide that and what they paid you. I think we have time for one more question. True, Luke?
That's right, Linda. And while folks are typing that question in, I might just thank everyone for coming and thank you for speaking. I thought your presentation was very well prepared and really entertaining, and I think each slide was really, really well thought out, so I appreciate that. I also wanted to thank the folks.
What's that?
I just also wanted to thank folks for attending and to encourage them to, when I send an email, encourage them to fill out the survey.
Yeah, it was a good group. I'm really glad people felt like they could type in the questions. That was kind of fun since we can't see each other. I hope you're all motivated to go home and keep some records. All you have to do is keep more records than you kept last year. That's all you really have to do. You're all very welcome. So a question for Luke. Will there be some information that will help me make my presentation better if I ever have to give it again?
Absolutely. We can encourage everyone who's listening now and who put their emails in the chat box to leave really detailed comments, and I'll be able to share those with you at the end of this week.
Good. I would like that. Nobody's typing. I think it's adios, everyone.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you. I had a good time.